was one of the key things, that the reason why science in Islam stopped dead in its tracks, and it did not stop dead in Latin Christendom. By the way, notice there's another Christendom that was also where science did not come to birth, and that was Eastern Christendom. And that was this idea of secondary causation. Aristotle had said that material bodies could act directly one upon the other. And as Aristotle's works were rediscovered in the early Middle Ages, it didn't take the Renaissance to rediscover the Greeks. The Middle Ages just rediscovered Greek scientific works. They didn't care about the art and literature and the architecture. That was the Renaissance. Okay? And they rediscovered it, and they talked about it for a while, and they said, yeah, this makes sense. You know, God is the author of all things, and he has endowed his creation with the ability to act directly upon itself. Aquinas wrote that, his teacher, Albertus Magnus, and any number of other authors of the time. William of Conscience said, in answer to some critics that were arguing against this whole idea of rational understanding of the natural world, he says, you say whatever it is that God can do it. He says, you fools, God can make a cow out of a tree, but has he ever done it? Therefore show some reason why a thing is so, or cease to hold that it is so. And so it went. That was what they called secondary causation. So why do objects fall to earth? Well, there's this force called gravity. Well, we say there's this force called gravity. To them, gravity was a property of the body itself. A body had gravitas, if it was an earth or a water. If it was an air or a fire, then it had levity, because it would rise, you say. So gravitas was whatever was this thing that made an object fall to the ground. And after going through that whole Newtonian sidetrack, Einstein finally set us back and said, no, Aristotle was right. Gravity is inherent in the existence of the mass itself, creates the gravity. Okay, cool. So it's amazing how we get more and more back to the Aristotelian stuff without realizing it. So, yeah, and maybe even if they had sat down and had things like wristwatches or stopwatches and stuff like that, and they could pull this off, they could have figured out that it falls at the rate of 32 feet per second if they used feet and seconds. But then the question would always, not the question, but in the back of their minds would always be, but who wrote the law? What is the cause of the law itself? So they were quite comfortable with the idea that they could explain everything in nature with natural causes.
Without violating their religion.
Without violating their religion. Now, that didn't go down in Islam. And everybody talks about the great Islamic philosophes, the philosophers. But the philosophes in Islam were always held as very low esteem. Above them were the Mutakalimun, who interpreted kalam, which was their genuine attempt to take Aristotelian logic and reason and apply it to Islamic theology, the way Aquinas did in Christendom. But they failed. Islam's greatest failure is that they got a hold of Aristotle, but they never actually had an Aquinas to make peace.
Killed.
Right.
Yeah. And above them, in esteem, were the traditional Islamic scholars, the Mujtahid. What they said went. And under them were the Mutakalimun, and they were a little bit suspect because they used this logic thing. And that struck them as impious, that God could be bound by logic. Whereas in the West, they said God can do anything except a logical contradiction. So the philosophes got along pretty well as long as there was a caliph who liked them. But to give you an idea, let me find it here. One of the first of the great philosophes was Al-Kindi. The others, Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as he was known in the West, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as he was called, and there was Ibn Hazm and a number of others. But Al-Kindi was one of the first, and he was the first of them to write comments on Aristotle And he was very lucky with his first two caliphs, Al-Mamun and Al-Mutasim. But his luck ran out with Al-Mutawakkil, the Sunni caliph. And according to Pervez Hoodboy, quote, it was not hard for the ulema, those are the religious scholars, the traditional mujtahid, to convince the ruler that the philosopher had very dangerous beliefs, and Mutawakkil soon ordered the confiscation of the scholar's personal library. But that was not enough. The 60-year-old Muslim philosopher also received 50 lashes before a large crowd, and observers who recorded the event say the crowd roared approval with each stroke. Averroes, the greatest of them all, was forced into exile. He was stripped of all of his offices, and he had to flee from Marrakesh after Al-Ghazali wrote his devastating critique of philosophy in general called The Incoherence of Philosophy, showing that philosophy was incoherent. Okay. Ibn Rushd wrote a reply called The Incoherence of the Incoherence. But it didn't sell big. Much later, a Turkish sultan commissioned a third book, which was entitled The Incoherence of the Incoherence of the Incoherence. At that point, the series stopped because I guess nobody wanted to read book 4 or whatever, because it'd be the same old, same old. But every single one of the major Islamic philosophers fell afoul of the dominant culture. You cannot find a natural philosopher in the Middle Ages who was ever persecuted for any of his conclusions in natural philosophy.
Let's step back and remind people sort of a timeline, because, as you said, people tend to go from Aristotle to the Renaissance thinking there was nothing in between.
Totally.
So we've got the Roman era from, let's say, BC 100 till AD 400. With Christianity entering in the last 100 years or so into the culture itself. From the fall of Rome, 476, until when do we have to wait before things get back on track?
These guys should like this. As the Roman Empire was collapsing, and they didn't know it was collapsing at the time, they thought it was going pretty cool. There were a number of people, the most famous of which is Boethius, who is sometimes called the last of the Romans and the first of the medievals. There were a number of others who wrote books which were collections of all the extant knowledge of the time. Romans weren't very original, but they were very thorough. And they are called collectively the late Roman encyclopediasts. Now, they weren't sitting down to put together an encyclopedia to survive the fall of the empire, because they didn't know that was going to be happening. Harry Seldon had not been born. But in fact, I'm sure that's where Isaac Asimov got the idea from.
Right.
These texts, Boethius had started out to translate Aristotle from Greek into Latin. By the way, that had never been done before. The Western Europeans did not lose Aristotle, they never had him. Boethius translated the logic works, the Nicomachean Ethics, some of the political works, and had just gotten started on the scientific works when he was executed. Not for anything he was doing, but politics with the emperor.
He did manage to get in the Consolation of Philosophy.
Yeah, he wrote his own thing too. That was cool.
And
I don't know, if I were waiting to be executed, would I write a book?
Why not?
What else are you going to do?
What else are you going to do?
It was asked, if you were told you had 6 months to live, what would you do? And he said, write faster.
So, but after the collapse of the Roman civilization, how long was it before?
So let's say from 400 to 800, Western Europeans were too busy trying to survive. The county of Burgundy, which is like in the middle of France there, was ravaged at one time or another by Arabs, Vikings, and Magyars. So they were just running all over Europe. There was a jihadi castle in the Alps until the 9th century. We don't hear about that too much nowadays. No. Don't want to offend. So, round about the year